All right. To generally get started, I know that you all know that I work with snails, but for those of you that are new to cave systems or don't study the biological aspect of caving, I always like to put a slide in here just to show you that there's just a vast biodiversity associated with these really unique systems. We have two vertebrate groups that occupy caves, salamanders and fish. And then we have, just a myriad of invertebrates like the Stigobromus amphipods that someone previously was speaking about finding in Texas. Stigobromus is the thing in the far right corner, about to eat a smaller, I think it's just a smaller individual of the same genus. We have isopods, we have crayfish, we have flatworms, and then we have, what I work with, which are freshwater snails and terrestrial snails. So the general outline of this talk, again, I think I'm going to try to make it much more casual, is just to generally tell you what kind of groups are associated with living underground. The general biodiversity, how many species, where are they, what do they look like? Telling you about problems that we have concerning their conservation, what threats are associated with these animals and where they live, and then ultimately, what we can do in the future to maybe quell some of those concerns and hopefully, just get a better understanding of these animals in general. And of course, shameless plug, I wrote a whole paper about this. It was a whole thing that I did, initiated by my lack of being able to do field work because of COVID. So me and several of my very great friends, whom I think some of you know, like Ben Hutchins or Ben Schwartz, that are in San Marcos, I think that they are far beyond my expertise on some of these topics, and it was very fun writing that with them. So if you would like a copy of it, I'd be happy to send it to you, because paywall science is garbage. Yeah, and that's the citation. So yeah, I think I have to go into a little bit of the vocabulary because most biological aspects of caving and cave-related species gets kind of complicated. And so, when I say groundwater snails, I really just am referring to those species that are obligately associated with underground environments or groundwater systems. There are stigophilic taxa, which, cave-loving or groundwater-loving species, which, really just, they opportunistically inhabit these systems. They don't really need to complete their whole life cycle within these systems. Sometimes you have many different surface snails that just kind of trickle their way into the entrance zone of a cave, or they're kind of an accidental introduction, and then they can somewhat persist for some periods of time. So really, I'm just referring to those things that are underground. They evolved, they adapted to complete their entire life cycle underground. So referring to the biodiversity, most of the global biodiversity of groundwater inhabiting snails belongs to a family called Hydrobiidae. I know that we don't all care about taxonomy, but just bear with me here for a second. So global biodiversity, there's about, I think 450, maybe 500 species that are described that are obligately inhabiting underground systems. And none of those species that are in that family live in North America. I think that we have very unique groups relative to, all of these other groups that are maybe, in Asia and Europe and Australia in some parts. So we have 5 different families that are associated with subterranean systems in the United States and in Mexico. And I actually just had a hand in describing the 5th one, which I've starred. Me and my graduate advisor, Nathan Whelan, we just recently described this whole brand new family of snails. And so we have 5 taxonomic families in North America. And the coolest part, I think, is just, seeing what the biodiversity looks like, seeing what these species, what they look like and where they are. So what really attracts me to these animals, other than, I just kind of so happened to have studied them early on in my college career, and then I just got more and more into the weeds of studying them, and now here I am, is in these underground ecosystems, these species take on incredibly unique morphologies relative to those animals that live on the surface. You have this one, in that kind of bottom row, second to the left, that is completely uncoiled. I have never seen a species that looks like this until I moved to Texas. This is an aquifer, deep aquifer dwelling species. I think it's called, I can't remember the common names. I'm so stuck in taxonomy land. I think it's called Phreatoceras taylori. I can't remember the common name, but beautiful, interesting snail. You have the middle row here. Two of these also live in Texas. They're kind of short range endemic species, meaning they only are known from a few caves and nowhere else, or maybe a well site, depending on where it was sampled from. And yeah, these beautiful fringes to their shell. And I think importantly, it's also important to note that these things are just the tiniest species that you'll ever see. The scale bar here is 1 millimeter. And so none of these animals are larger than, your pinky nail. They're probably a third of the size of your pinky nail. And just tiny, tiny specimens. It's very, very hard to sample for them. And thus it is very hard to learn about them. These three species on the right, they are from the Ozarks and the Appalachians regions, respectively. And this one on the top was a species that I actually co-discovered and then co-described with a few friends of mine. One in particular is a Texas resident, Catherine Perez. She does incredible work with some of these animals in Texas. And I shamelessly, it had this bright orange glow to it. I went to the University of Tennessee, so I named the species Tennesseeensis. And so it is the Tennessee cave snail. Overall, there are 40 different species so far described in the United States and Mexico. I'm in the process right now of getting samples for, I think, 3 or 4 more, both genus and species that are going to be new to science. I'll get around to that eventually, helping to describe those fauna. One is from Oklahoma, 2 of them are from northern Mexico, and then we have another one in the Appalachians in southeastern Tennessee. And so there will be more species eventually described. I hope it is not all on me to do it, because if so, it'll probably take a long time. But of these 40 some odd species, 13 of them, so about 33%, are only known from a single cave or a single well or a single sampling opportunity and nowhere else. So many of these species, just owing to the fact that we don't know where they are, we don't know how far distributed they are, they would be, it would warrant federally listing them as either threatened or endangered, yet because no one studies them, the process of garnering protections for these species is incredibly limited. Yeah, just to show you a few more of the recently weird species that were described, just showing you, these things do not look like other species that you find on the surface. I don't know why they adapt these interesting features. I don't know what about living underground kind of selects for these unique traits, but Catherine Perez and another one of her students, Dominique, recently described another Texas groundwater associated species, Phreatodrobia spica, the spiky cave snail, and it has all of these little micro spikes all over its shell. And then with a friend of mine in northern Mexico, Alex Chaya, we recently described a new genus and species of, we presume it's extinct, just because these are all relic shells from dried up groundwater sites. But Phreatovischia spinosa, so these huge spines on the shells, I think it's, fairly prehistoric looking, but just really, really interesting animals to me. I think what draws us all into, learning more about these animals, learning more about these ecosystems is that they're beautiful, they're very interesting to be in. I told you that in Tennessee, in Alabama, in Georgia, most of these systems are aquatic. You just have streams or rivers ripping through the karst, and forming these very long, complex systems that, I had the wonderful opportunity to learn more about and sample. And so, here on the left, we have a picture of me and a friend of mine, Evan, sampling for the Tennessee cave snail that we described in a cave in Tennessee. We have another cave in the interior plateau in Tennessee in the center. And then we have an aquatic system in, I think, northern Oklahoma in somewhere. And I don't know if most of you will recognize this person, but on the right, we have Dante Fenolio. He's the conservation coordinator at the San Antonio Zoo. He and I are in the process of describing that new species in Oklahoma right now. We have my friend Matt taking a nice big swim into, I think that's an Alabama cave, sampling for more aquatic fauna. We have a beautiful cenote aquifer in the Yucatan, beautiful system. I think it often requires diving to collect some of the invertebrates there. So for those of you who have been to Mexico and have appreciated the systems down there. And then we have Ben Hutchins and another person who works for TPWD, whose name escapes me. A lot of the ways that they sample for these groundwater taxa is they just pump groundwater right out of the kind of interchange zone of the surface and the subsurface water. And so, you just go out, you take a big steel perforated spike and a hammer that you can see right next to them, and they spike it down maybe 1 meter, 2 meters into the water. They attach, a well pipe or an outflow well that you can get at like Home Depot for $30. And then they just pump out things and hope for the best. Another way, you just attach a net to the outflow of a well and just kind of hope for bycatch. And by the way, I don't really know how long this presentation is supposed to be. If you want me to rush through things, if you want me to, stop at some point, just let me know. I'm also not paying attention to the chat, so flag me down if I'm doing too much or too little. The generalized distribution of these animals is kind of limited to the biogeographic regions where most subterranean species live. We have the Appalachian, we have the interior low plateau, the Ozarks, the Edwards Aquifer, and then a few other karst regions in northern Mexico, and then the Yucatan. Each of these species are limited to a single region. So there is no species that lives in more than one of these regions. As far as we can reckon, every one of these species has an incredibly limited distribution, especially in the Edwards Aquifer, because most of the systems here are relatively disconnected. But then again, I could just be completely lying. It's just that we don't really know. And that's part of the problem. But this is just to show you where, in the US, in Mexico, these animals occur. I know this plot is kind of hard to read. Maybe I'll kind of gloss over it. I think the general pattern that you should take away is that the family Cochleophagus is the most diverse, and it is very widely distributed among every one of the karst regions that are associated with these little colors. I apologize, by the way, if you're colorblind. I do not know if this is colorblind friendly. The other thing to take away, and I think this is more important to some of the topics later, that about 30% of them are critically imperiled. Another 25 or so % are imperiled, and the others are either not assessed or vulnerable. And so every one of the described species are either, we don't know if they're vulnerable, or they certainly are, and most of them are on the brink of extinction. The species in the Edwards Aquifer are the most biodiverse, which is exciting for me living in Texas now. And a lot of these species, like I said before, are only known from one well, from one cave, from one groundwater pump sample. And so the fact that we only know a single site is highly concerning, because any one catastrophic event like a truck turning over on interstate and spilling whatever it is into a stream could literally wipe a species off the face of the planet. And so this is of great concern to me, of great concern to, I'm sure, many of you. And that's why I work with these kind of understudied animals. This is just kind of going into the nitty-gritty of the rankings, not too important. All this to say, they are incredibly imperiled, incredibly endangered. People need to study them more. So, I mentioned because they are only known from so few sites, you would think that they would be candidates for some kind of state or federal protection. But of the 40 species that have been described, only one of them are listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act, which means effectively only one of them gets continued streams of funding to facilitate management efforts, to facilitate, protecting the immediate landscape around the cave. And that one endangered species is the Tumbling Creek cave snail, and it lives in the Ozarks. And I think that cave system is in Missouri, but I could be mistaken, maybe Arkansas. In any case, it's known from a single site, just as many of these species are. And fortunately, there have been a ton of management and conservation initiatives associated with that cave, because there are a lot of other endemic species in that cave. And so, part of how you protect these animals is you get land associated with where the watershed is. You protect as much of the water as possible, so what's pumping into that cave is clean and high quality, and what these animals are used to inhabiting. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. There are 2 other species under review. One is in Texas, and the other is in Alabama. These are also 2 single site endemic species. And in Mexico, they have kind of a similar, it's basically the analog for the Endangered Species Act. There are 2 species in Mexico listed as endangered, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will put much effort into increasing our knowledge of them or increasing study of any one of these species. I think that the first part of any conservation initiative is to learn more about the animals, right? And there are only a handful of people in the country, in these 2 countries, that care to do that. And most of them are, I guess, maybe tired and busy doing other things. So the threats associated with these species, part of what we did with this paper is just try to speak to what don't we know and how do we fix that. So the biggest threat, I've mentioned this time and time again, I think, is that as far as we understand, they don't have very large distributions. They aren't known from, multiple rivers across multiple states. They're known from a single site. And so how do you conserve something that is only limited to one well, one cave, one stream, effectively when, you're in central Austin, or you're in downtown San Antonio, or you're on the campus of Texas State University, because that's where that well is that has so many endemic species. Other big threats are just general changes in hydrology and nutrient input into these systems. The ways that we manipulate the land on the surface have immediate impacts and kind of sublethal impacts to what lives underneath the surface. And so we have to consider broad land management in order to conserve these underground ecosystems. That kind of goes hand in hand with habitat modification. If I dump a whole bunch of pollution into a surface stream that is connected to the aquifer system in some way, or it's a part of the recharge zone, I will certainly have impacts to the underground fauna. I put a picture of a crayfish here because invasive species are also of concern. In the Tumbling Creek Cave, they have kind of a management effort where they are just, straight up removing the invasive red ring crayfish that has started to inhabit this system. I don't know where it was introduced from. I think it's Alabama, probably. But in any case, it's not supposed to be there, and they have active efforts to remove it from the cave system. Recreational activities, there has been cited sources that say, oh, if you romp around in a stream long enough, that'll have detrimental impacts to caves. I think we all are very aware of, being stewards of conservation whenever we enter a system. So it's always really important to, minimize the impact of these systems, even though they're fun to be in and we all enjoy them. You know, now that I've spoken to threats, I kind of want to get into what do we do about it, right? And so the biggest thing is the knowledge deficit. We only know that they're from one site. Okay, great. But what else do we know beyond that? What are the problems that could be associated with that site? What are, the basic biological features of this species? Does it, how far does it move? How much does it reproduce? How often does it reproduce? How large are populations? How many individuals of a population do you need to carry on an effective genetic lineage of any one of these species? What are potential genetic concerns? So a lot of what I have done with these animals is with relation to their genetics, with their systematics, and with understanding potential problems of having really small distributions. I don't want to get too in the weeds here with the biology, but if you have a very small population, an immediate concern could be inbreeding, because you're breeding with your immediate relatives, things that are very close to your proximity. I can't imagine that these snails move around all that much. And so if you only have one population on Earth, how much could that be driving them into the ground that they can't distribute, that they can't, get out of this landlocked area, so to speak, that they're in? These are all concerns that are on my mind, and I think on others as well. So we need to get general studies done. We need to understand about their ecology, their life history, their anatomy, their morphology, just all the things, all the ologies that you could throw at this thing. We don't know. So going back to the Tumbling Creek cave snail, I think that is the perfect city on a hill that we all want to live in relation to how you study these things. So, they're only known from a single system, and that lends itself well to doing long-term monitoring of them. They have understood kind of the population dynamics at play within the system. They understand how many of the individuals there are, how much they move around, where they traverse, how often do they reproduce? Can we artificially create settings where they can reproduce in zoos or aquaria or things like that to help bolster populations? I think they've also put artificial habitat where some of it got washed out by increased sedimentation. So they put, I think, ceramic tile into the cave stream itself to give the animals something to cling to. And it worked. The population came back a little bit. I think recently there's been kind of a boom bust cycle they're trying to figure out. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting conservation angles that you can take on these animals. Another one in that bottom left picture is Manitow Cave in central, northeastern, I'm just going to name all the cardinal directions because I don't actually know. It's in Alabama. It is I think an archaeologically significant site. There are Cherokee glyphs on the walls. It's very interesting from a human history angle, but also there's that single site endemic snail that also lives there that is up for federal listing sometime in the near future, maybe, hopefully. They have done a lot of individual monitoring and genetic studies and ecological studies of that species. So just a lot of good stuff. All right, my final long-winded ramblings are coming to a close. So I think this is the most foundational thing that I could ever pitch. Just do more. Just develop standard protocols to study and monitor these animals. I think that's goal number one. In the aquifer here, here in Texas, they are doing a ton of that pump sampling that I referred to, and they are finding that these animals are much more distributed in some cases than we had previously realized. Effectively, every time we study cave animals, we learn that we don't really know much about them to begin with. And so that's part of the fun, but also, I think there's, an immediacy to doing these types of studies just owing to how much urban sprawl there is, how much development there is. Think about Austin. We all live here. I just recently moved here, as well as, hundreds of thousands of other people that are constantly moving into the city. These animals are in our backyard, and if we don't targetedly, effectively study them, I mean, they're just going to go extinct without us even realizing it. So I think that's, that's something that's always on my mind and other conservationists. So that goes hand in hand with baseline ecological studies of individual species. Yeah, we want to understand how we broadly affect groundwater systems in general, but if we don't know anything about individual species, we don't have much of a leg to stand on in getting state protection or federal protection or anything such as that. A big thing of mine has been, if you all know anything about the endangered species that are already listed in Texas, you'll know that a lot of these species have been described based on morphology. This thing looks like this thing and that thing doesn't, so they must be different species. Well, as it turns out, that wasn't the best approach to studying biodiversity at the time, and especially with things that live in caves and live underground, they kind of converge upon looking very similar if they live in similar systems. And so something that looks just like another thing that you spot could be two very, very different species separated by, hundreds of thousands, millions of years of evolution. And so if we're not effectively studying the taxonomy, the genetics, how they're all related, then we're not developing units of conservation to work with. We're just kind of guessing, and that's never the best approach to protecting things. And the last thing that I think is, imperative is you got to work with private landowners. I had just the most wonderful experiences working in Tennessee, especially with landowners. I have not had the same experiences in working with landowners in Texas. I think that there is, a huge gap between what these landowners care about in protecting their land, protecting their quality of living, and understanding basic concepts about conservation, the benefits that these species may have, and more along those lines. In Tennessee, I would knock on someone's door, ask to go into their cave, and then I would get out, and they would make me they would have a barbecue for me. And here, I knock on someone's door, and they answer with a shotgun and tell me to go away. And so, there's kind of a dichotomy that I'm dealing with, and how to effectively try to go about studying these animals, because if you can't get in to a private property, that's a huge gap in something's distribution, and that's a huge gap in you discovering new species, and that's just a huge gap in general. So yeah, we got to do more. It's very important. And I think, yeah, that's the last thing I have to say. Sorry to end on such a not chipper note. And I will stop sharing my screen so I can actually pay attention to the chat now.